Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the third webinar of CARL's Inclusive Collections series. So from shelves to streams, how format shifts impact diversity in academic film collections, which has been organized by CARL's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Working Group. I'm Julie Moray, a Senior Program Officer at CARL. Before we begin, please note that simultaneous translation into French is available for this session and can be accessed using the interpretation icon in the bottom right corner of your Zoom window. Une traduction simultanée en français est disponible pour cette session et est accessible via l'icône d'interprétation dans le coin inférieur droit de votre écran. I'd like to start by acknowledging that today's speakers and attendees are joining us from the unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. My home and the CARL office, located here in Ottawa, capital of the country we now know as Canada, are built on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. We welcome you to add your own acknowledgements into the chat and to honor and recognize the ongoing contributions of the First Peoples of these lands. I would also like to take this opportunity to go over logistics for the session. Links to the CARL Code of Conduct have been included at the beginning of the chat thread, and the organizers of this webinar are committed to providing a welcoming, professionally engaging, and safe experience. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact Susan Haig, CARL Executive Director, whose contact information has also been listed in the chat. Speakers will be taking questions at the end, and you're encouraged to type your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Vicky J. Long, reference librarian at the University of Windsor and a member of CARL's EDI working group, is also present and will be helping to moderate the Q&A and chat for us. Finally, auto-generated captions have been enabled for this webinar, the presentation portion of which is being recorded. So now I'd like to invite our speakers to introduce themselves and lead our discussion today.
Thanks, Julie.
So hello, everybody. I'm James Mason. I'm a digital initiatives and metadata librarian at the University of Toronto. Super happy to be here. And I'm with Trevor Deck.
Hi, everyone. I'm Trevor Deck. I'm the Music and Film Collections Management Librarian at the University of Toronto. Thanks to the CARL for having us here. And we're coming to you today from the University of Toronto, which operates on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting is taking place, is to home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. So we're excited to be with you today to discuss a topic that lies at the intersection of technology, education, and diversity. That is, the evolution of music and film access and acquisition in academic libraries. Our presentation is based on research James, myself, and our fellow colleague Amelia Clarkson conducted for a recently published paper in the Canadian Journal of Academic Librarianship entitled Shifting Paradigms: The Impact of Streaming on Diversity in Academic Library Film Collections. This presentation provides a fairly high-level overview of that research, so if you're interested in getting a more detailed analysis of the research after this presentation, we'd highly recommend checking out the full paper. And unfortunately, Amelia couldn't join us for this discussion today, as she's busy settling into a new role as Scholarly Communications and Copyright Librarian at Ontario Tech University. But we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge Amelia for her major contributions to this research project and resulting paper. All right, so in recent years, discussions surrounding library resources have frequently centered on the transition from physical to digital formats, particularly when it comes to print materials. At the same time, there's been a growing emphasis on the importance of equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts within post-secondary institutions, with calls to action often focusing on expanding collections to better reflect diverse perspectives. However, while much attention has been paid to the print materials in these conversations, the unique challenges and opportunities presented by audiovisual materials have often been overlooked. So today we'll explore dual shifts occurring in academic libraries. A decrease in the acquisitions of physical films and sound recordings, and at the same time, an increase in content aimed at supporting EDI mandates. And in doing so, we'll ask two crucial questions. First, does the shift away from collecting physical materials also mean a shift away from including diverse perspectives in our audiovisual collections? And secondly, do we have the necessary data to draw measurable and demonstrable conclusions about the diversity in our AV collections? And to address these questions, we'll provide a brief overview of the existing literature on this topic over the past 2 decades. We'll examine efforts to assess markers of diversity within large library collections, which provided us with the groundwork for a methodology that combines data from library catalogs and external sources like Wikidata. By analyzing metadata such as the names of individuals in powerful creative roles and the representation of EDI subjects within film narratives, we'll aim to gain insights into the diversity of our collections. And as we'll discover, the path to meaningful conclusions is not without its challenges. Inconsistent and incomplete data over time hinder our ability to draw strong conclusions, highlighting the complexities of EDI analysis within library collections. Even with the augmentation of catalog metadata using external resources, we find ourselves grappling with the limitations of our current approaches. Moreover, our exploration will confront the question of format, specifically physical versus streaming access. While format undoubtedly plays a role, we'll uncover the importance of curation and choice in building a diverse audiovisual collection. Despite the challenges inherent in assessing collecting audiovisual materials, which have always existed in a state of rapid flux, we'll recognize the pivotal role that intentional curation plays in shaping inclusivity in our collections. So as we dive into today's discussion on accessing and acquiring music and film in academic libraries, I invite you to keep these two questions in mind. One, how can we best ensure that our collections reflect the diverse perspectives of our communities? And how can we navigate the evolving landscape of film and audio formats to create inclusive and accessible collections for all? So over the course of the next 40 minutes, we'll dive deeper into these pressing issues and seek to chart a path forward in the pursuit of equity, diversity, and inclusion within libraries. So we'll start by highlighting some of the previous literature on this subject and discuss how we landed on our methodology. So when we began our literature review, we found that past studies addressing questions of diversity generally fell into two broad categories. The first is quite broad in scope, looking at many different categories of diversity and multiple formats. It's a comprehensive approach that aims to capture representation across a collection as a whole. The second approach narrows the focus to a single marker of diversity and applies that lens to a specific format like film, or even narrows further to something like DVD. For example, one study we looked at examined how many films in a DVD collection are directed by women and used that as a proxy for assessing diversity. The focus method allows for a deeper analysis and often more precise results, but it also risks missing the broader picture. It tends to overlook intersectionality, or how aspects of identity like race, sexuality, or disability interact with gender to shape representation. And across both approaches, there's a clear tension. The more detailed and rigorous your analysis, the harder it becomes to scale that method to larger collections. So over 20 years ago, one of the first papers to assess diversity in what Chu refers to as a multimedia collection was published. This work explored methodologies for evaluating diversity across media formats, including films and sound recordings. In the case of film, the proposed method was remarkably thorough. Watch each film in its entirety and assess not only whether it features diverse subject matter, but how that subject was treated within the film. Chu also emphasized the importance of multiple perspectives in this evaluative process, recommending that it not be limited to the judgment of a single librarian. Incorporating diverse viewpoints was seen as a way to reduce individual bias and arrive at a more nuanced understanding. The underlying idea was that this approach could be applied to any aspect of equity, diversity, and inclusion, whether race, gender, sexuality, age, or others. But as you can imagine, it's an incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive process. Over the next 2 decades, while no standard methodology has emerged, other approaches have been explored that built on and refined these early ideas, many of which helped shape our own methodology that we're using today. So let's explore a couple of those methodologies. First, we have a 2019 study by Rachel Tilley and C.C. Chapman at Tulane University, which examined the representation of women directors in their collection's library DVD collection. This highlights one way to assess diversity in film by examining who's behind the camera. In this case, the focus was specifically on directors and specifically within the DVD format. To carry out their analysis, the researchers searched the 45 field in their catalog for director names that matched a master list of women directors they developed from a combination of online resources. They also noted that since the library metadata and catalog records have only begun incorporating demographic data about creators fairly recently, an augmented methodology might pull gender information from Wikidata, which was something we applied to our own methodology. Next, let's look at a methodology of assessing subject headings related to specific EDI areas across an entire library collection. Julia Proctor's 2020 study at Penn State University Libraries used Library of Congress subject headings to identify LGBTQ+ content and benchmarked their holdings against other top 10 ARL ranked libraries. This approach revealed significant gaps in LGBTQ+ representation, particularly outside of the children's and young adult literature. Proctor's study underscores the limitations of catalog data alone, such as inconsistent cataloging or a lack of appropriate subject headings in the classification system. In acknowledging the limits of your methodology, Proctor suggests that future studies could incorporate multiple methods of collection analysis, such as the inclusion of a citation analysis based on Penn State's thesis and dissertations that focuses on LGBTQ-related and targeted analyses of related issues and targeted analyses of focusing on intersectionality. Finally, we examined an academic journal using a digital humanities approach to assess both content of articles and the diversity of their creators. Yelena Sims and colleagues conducted a comprehensive analysis of over 20 years of publications in the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. They used large data sets from the journal's archives and supplemented this with data from free sources like Wikidata. Their methodology involved computationally extracting demographic information from author biographies and manually coding article content to assess its relevance to various diversity-focused groups. This dual focus on creator identity and content allowed them to identify significant racial and gender disparities and highlighted the need for a more inclusive publishing practices. This approach inspired us to develop our own methodology using large data sets and open data sources to enhance the diversity of our collections. So next, I'll pass it on to James to discuss our methodology.
James, you are muted.
Thank you. Yeah, that's my famous trick, everybody. So anyways, thanks for having me here. So when we were proceeding with developing our methodology, it was important for us to, A, keep in mind that our goals ultimately were to help us understand the diversity of our various collections were, specifically media collections, and we wanted to do it in a somewhat comparative fashion so we could compare physical collections with online streaming collections. It was also important that our methodology and our goals aligned with the University of Toronto's diversity statement. So we've put a couple of points up here on the slides that you could take a look at, but I think the second one was one that was perhaps most impactful on me. So if I could read that out to you. Diversity is defined as the sum of ways people both alike and different and recognizes and embraces differences as uniquenesses. I found that a compelling statement to help us move forward. Next slide, please, Trevor. So our methodology ended up depending on sort of a two-pronged approach. We did a demographic audit of the creators of the items in our various collections, and we did an analysis of our subject headings that are associated with those various collections through an EDI lens. So when we were doing this project, again, we were relying on work that had been done previously. So we wanted to build on not just the data itself, but the methodologies to help determine and develop and gather data. We wanted to look at whole collections, not just individual titles. And we wanted to be able to compare these collections. And to do this, one of the other questions, again, Trevor had mentioned this, but just to reiterate, one of the important questions we were asking was even, do we have the data necessary to make any concrete conclusions or to allow us to act on whatever research we do? So the first approach, the demographic audit, while understanding that the metadata that we have is flawed, to a certain extent, it's also a huge amount of data. The metadata collection, the metadata we have that describes a various collection is it's really a massive resource. So we wanted to see if we could use it in effective ways. Um, then once we had extracted information from our metadata records, we wanted to see if we could augment that data in any way from free online data sources. So we thought about this a little bit and we looked around and we tried different things, but what seemed to be most beneficial for us was Wikipedia and Wikidata. And also this had been talked about previously in the literature. Uh, it was free, it was accessible. They provide APIs so we could act on the data programmatically and we can incorporate it into a programmatic environment. For us, we used Python. So that was useful. And also, it was able to effectively allow us to augment our collection metadata. And I'll talk a bit more about this later. So when we talked about the subject heading analysis, here we really wanted to grab as many subject headings for the various collections as we could. Then we brought them together, we collocated them, we coded them, and then we analyzed them, and this helped us compare our collections. All right, next slide, please, Trevor. So back to the demographic audit. What we got from our metadata was primarily names. So we extracted the names from various places in our metadata. The first place we looked was 100 fields and a 700 fields. And for the people out there that don't have all the mark fields memorized, as I'm sure there might be one or two of you don't, those are fields that represent names. So when we have those names, they're structured data that responds to specific cataloging practices. And why that's useful for us is because it's predictable how they behave, and so it's easier to act on them programmatically. Then we have a subfield E or a subfield 4, depending on what sort of iteration of the record they are, give us relator terms. So the subfield E is more current practice that actually spells out what the relator term is. The subfield 4 gives us a code, but that was all right because we were able to run that code through sort of a thesaurus we established that maps it to the general terms we wanted, which allowed us to understand the roles the people involved in the creation of the item were. So when we were looking at our film collection and our audio collection, this was different. It had different importance to us. So when we're talking about our films, it was really important that we grab the names that were associated with the creation of the item that were playing the the most role of power, I guess, in the creative process. So we were looking specifically for things like directors, producers, screenwriters. But this was less important for us when we were looking at our audio, primarily because the named people, whether they were performers, composers, or conductors, tended to be integral in the impetus or the creative process and the creation of the item itself. Whereas with films, an actor doesn't really give us much idea of intentionality. If we have an Asian actor in the film, well, maybe we could say that gives us a certain degree of diversity. But if we don't understand how that Asian actor was portrayed, I mean, it could be, honestly, it could be just a stereotype that they're a kung fu chef or something. And so we really didn't feel like that was meaningful. And so we focused primarily on what we were calling the roles of power in the creative process. So with the films, we have about 24,000 DVDs in our collection to give you a perspective. And we were able to acquire 56,421 names that we were able to effectively augment with data from Wikidata. When we look at the music, we have pardon me. And not only did we look at our physical collection, but we looked at 4 streaming collections that we have at the University of Toronto libraries. We looked at Criterion on Command, DocuSeek, Canopy, and what we call MyMedia, which is a local created and curated streaming service. So now when we look at music, we were looking at we looked primarily at two collections, our Naxos classical music, or Naxos Music Online, which has about 140,000 titles associated with it, and our physical collection, which we had about 74,000 titles. So roughly half as many titles is represented in our physical collection as is represented in Naxos. So once we got these names, we normalized them. And so some specific examples of what we did was we made them all lowercase. We removed diacritics. We ensured a standard name order. We got rid of dates. We got rid of associated terms. We got rid of ending punctuation, for example. We got rid of ending and beginning white spaces, things like that. And this had the effect of bringing names together and normalizing them in the sense that, so for example, if we were talking about somebody like Tchaikovsky and a diacritic was either not used at all or used inappropriately, it would still bring all of them together. So we wouldn't be searching multiple versions of Tchaikovsky. We would just have the one. So then what we did is we searched these using an automated process in Wikidata. And by the automated process, I mean we loaded names as a list or more as a dictionary into Python. Then Python went through each one of those dictionaries and grabbed the key, which would be the name, and it would grab the description, which would be the description, which would be the description or the relator term, director, screenwriter, things like that. Then it searched these using the API in Wikidata. So it would bring back a list of results. As you can imagine, we've all searched Wikipedia before. So there was going to be a number of false hits. So that's where the relator term became important. We looked at the occupation that was listed for the person, or the script looked at the occupation that was listed for the person in Wikidata and compared that with the relator term. And we had some crosswalks set up and some thesauri set up, so they didn't have to be the exact term. So looking at the music, for example, Vladimir Horowitz, if his occupation was listed as a pianist, it would transfer over to the relator term that was used in the cataloging record, and we would be able to find him. So if the name matched and the occupation matched, we assumed it was the right person. If one of those things didn't match, we went on to the next name in the list. And as I mentioned earlier, we were able to, for our DVD collection, we were able to augment 56,000 plus names. So really, we were talking about a mass amount of data that was really, hopefully turned out to be quite meaningful. I believe it did. And then after we did this, we were able to chart the information, compare the information, and analyze it and make some conclusions. Next slide, Trevor. So then the subject heading analysis was the second part of what we did. So then looking at our various collections, we extracted all the subject headings. And by this, I'm specifically meaning the library subject headings from the records. And we created in Python a counter object. And now what a counter object is it's basically a type of dictionary, but the key would be the unique name in this case, or the unique item. In this case, we're talking about subject heading. So it would be the unique subject heading, and then the value would be how many times that subject heading was used. So we end up with a unique list of subject headings with the amount of times they were used. Then we took these lists and we coded them according to two major categories. One we called neutral terms, and the second we called active terms. And here on the slide, I've referred to it as social justice terms because that's where we got the active terms from, a list published by the American School Psychology Association on social justice terms. So we use that as a type of thesaurus for us to collect our various active subject headings. Then we're able to compare the results and draw some conclusions. So next slide, please, Trevor. So if we look at what I mean a little bit more closely by neutral and active terms, Neutral terms could be things like physical and mental disabilities, gender and sexuality, women's issues. Whereas when we look at the non-neutral terms or the active terms, we see things like power, prejudice, oppression, um, allyship and advocacy, racism, terms that really address intentionality much more so than the neutral terms. Not only do we know that maybe there are women being talked about here, but we understand a little bit more about how they're being spoken about. So to really reiterate this point, if we saw a subject heading that was, say, women detectives, we would say, okay, that gives us a little bit of an idea of the diversity. That's useful, but it's really a rather neutral term because it doesn't really tell us about intentionality. It doesn't really inform us about the narrative content of this item in regards to EDI. It just sort of suggests there is an element of diversity. So we would have put that in our neutral term. However, we would have thought, okay, that's a little bit more, there's a little bit more intentionality behind that, that's a little bit more active, and we would have put it in our non-neutral terms. All right, next slide, please. So now I'll talk a little bit about the music, some of the results we found in music. As I'd mentioned previously, we had about half as many records in CDs as we do in the Naxos collection. I think I said 74,000. I lied. It's 79,000. So a little bit more more than half the CDs than we did for streaming records from Naxos. That said, about the same amount of names, percentage-wise, were extracted from the CD's records as from the Naxos records. When we talk about the Naxos records, there was a little bit more names that were able to be enhanced from the Naxos collection than the CD collection, but not altogether unreasonable. And then when we look at actual unique names that we were able to address, they're coming in fairly similar, again, when we take into consideration the different sizes of the collection. So next slide, please. But when we start to look at some of what we see, when we look at the data that we got back, we didn't get necessarily as much data as we would like to, but I think we got enough back that started to tell us an interesting story. So if we look at our CD collection, for example, we could say the percentage of creators that are Canadian was substantially more than what we would see in Naxos. And perhaps surprisingly, the same could be said for people coming from the United States. Europe was by far more important or the most important for both collections, but clearly it was most important for Naxos. So this perhaps speaks a little bit about the voices that are being heard. So it's a little bit of a different view on diversity because just because they're from Canada doesn't mean they're Black or doesn't mean they're Indigenous, obviously. But it does at least suggest there's a voice from Canada being represented. And so when we look at other, we could say the same sort of thing. We don't know if this person that's coming from a country in Africa is Black, but we do know he's coming from a country in Africa, and that's at the very least a slightly different perspective than we might have otherwise had. And so that's what we're able to find out. Next slide, please, Trevor. If we look at, I've used the term gender here, and I think that that's probably likely not quite appropriate. Sex may be the better term because it really was able to tell us just whether it was a male or female. It wasn't really telling us about how people identify, and it didn't really, not effectively anyways, address issues of non-binary or any other sort of gender association that people might have. So I think it's best to, again, like when we were looking at the country of origin previously, this tells us something, but it also doesn't tell us maybe everything we'd like to hear. But what we do see is if we look at Naxos, the representation from women is substantially less than what we see in our physical collection, which in and of itself is really not doing super great when it comes to inclusion of women. But just looking at these numbers, I would say it's about twice as much. Next slide, please, Trevor. So if we look at the names that were actually extracted from the various collections, I've shown here the top 10. And what we're seeing, which is possibly not a surprise to anybody, is a whole lot of white European men from the past. But we're also seeing, I feel like we're seeing a really large degree of parallelism between the two collections. We look at Mozart, and in our CD collection, we have 6,300 times his name was mentioned. And in the Naxos, 9,200. So we would have expected to see maybe twice as much. Not quite, but we see with Bach, again, they're fairly parallel, not quite the exactly what we would like to see, but we're seeing the same names and we're seeing very similar amounts of percentages. So when we talk about diversity, or if we talk about EDI in any ways with this collection, what this suggests to me is it's really the long tail becomes extra important. It's those one-offs that we have, those things that perhaps were requested by professors or students that needed something specific for the research they were working on, or things that are just more obscure in general, and therefore they're representing EDI better, perhaps because of their obscurity. So I think it's really in the long tail that the story for this collection becomes interesting. Next slide, Trevor. And I think that I'm going to pass it off to you now.
Great, thanks, James. Yeah, so let's now touch briefly on some contextual considerations around our music collection analysis and highlight some notable differences between the examinations of our music and film collections. So the analysis of our Naxos and CD collections had us identify three main areas: the gender of the performer or composer, the noted country of birth, and the date of birth of each artist identified. One interesting, if rather unsurprising, anecdote in this research was the trend across time. As evidenced in our previous slide, we noticed a distinct lack of diversity in the most commonly occurring results. However, when we factored in the date of birth of composers and performers, we noticed a significantly more diversity in both our CD and streaming collections in the more contemporary eras. So this speaks to the importance of continuing to collect materials by contemporary composers, whether it be physical or digital format. One aspect that we have yet to discuss in the context of this research is that of circulation and usage statistics. Like most libraries, our circulation statistics for CDs have been consistently declining over the past decade. Meanwhile, usage statistics in Naxos have stayed fairly static over recent years. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise given that most music is now consumed over streaming services nowadays. And given the low circulation stats for CDs, it's very understandable that libraries are reassessing collection strategies around the format. At the University of Toronto, while we are still purchase a fair amount of CDs each year, we have generally been attempting to avoid duplicating content on CD that we have access to on Naxos, except in cases of Canadian composers or performers. Well, Naxos covers the majority of labels that we would have previously comprehensively collected in physical format. There are some notable exceptions. For example, ECM would be one notable omission on the Naxos Jazz platform. Moreover, there are many examples of lesser-known labels or self-published works that are not represented in Naxos. These are the types of materials where we find the most notable examples of underrepresented artists in our collections. So despite the lack of data in the way of usage statistics to support the sort of comprehensive CD acquisition practices in the time for Naxos and other streaming services, we still feel it's important to have some sort of budget flexibility to allow for collecting music in physical formats. A dedicated budget line for CD acquisitions allows us to purchase individual titles rather than relying on what's currently available on Naxos. This also allows us to respond to specific curricular needs where Naxos holdings may be insufficient. One obvious limitation of our research concerning Naxos, our Naxos analysis, is that we only looked at the Naxos music library, which is centered around Western classical music, and therefore inherently limited in terms of representation. The next step in this research may be to also include records from Naxos World Music and Naxos Jazz. This would perhaps provide a better apples-to-apples comparison of our CD collection. That said, many important labels and artists are still missing from Naxos's coverage, and continuing to collect physical music will ensure these gaps are properly filled. Moreover, while Naxos's coverage has remained fairly static over the years, we can't be sure that everything available on Naxos now will be available indefinitely going forward. As we have seen in the consumer streaming platforms in both music and film over the past several years, changes in licensing can result in subtle or dramatic shifts in terms of content on a given streaming platform. Therefore, continuing to collect CDs ensures long-term access to important content, along with helping us increase the diversity within our sound recording collections. And before we move on to look at our film analysis, I'll quickly point out a key difference between our music and film methodologies. In examining our film collection from an EDI lens, we were able to utilize subject headings in the catalog records in attempt to dig into EDI-related elements within our content of the film collections. So next, let's look at the results from our film analysis. And before we dive into the results, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of the various purchase models and licensing models employed from our film resources, as this will provide some important context when we look at the findings. So looking at the chart here, the top 3 platforms are all streaming services where libraries license access to predetermined collections of films. In the case of Criterion On Demand, for example, libraries pay an annual subscription fee for access to a select collection of titles determined by the platform and the distributors it represents. For Canopy, it's similar in that the vendor controls what's available overall, but there's a key difference. Within that catalog, libraries can select and license individual titles, giving us a bit more control over what we add. DocuSeek represents a one-time only purchase model where we license collections of films outright, though the vendor still curates those collections. And the last 2 collections represent individually licensed or purchased titles. Our individually licensed streaming titles are hosted on an in-house streaming server called MyMedia, and our physical collection consists of DVDs, Blu-rays, as well as older formats like VHS, and these are selected both by a title-by-title basis, as well as through an approval plan that is tailored to support our specific curricular needs.
All right. So I see that there was a question in the question and answer that I think maybe it's important to take the time to answer right now instead of waiting to the end. There's some concern about some of the language that I've been using, and so I'd like to start by first off apologizing for any offense that I've caused anybody. It was unintentional, and I've certainly been trying to make the effort to use appropriate language. So the question was about what I'd done to educate myself in advance. So I think it's perhaps a broader question than that too. And I think it may be translated to what business does a white, middle-aged, cisgendered man have talking about this in the first place? And it's certainly something I wrestled with. I'm not an expert on EDI. I'm not an expert on diversity, and in no way am I an expert on the experience that trans people face. That said, I am a librarian at the University of Toronto and have some sort of control over the collection we have. And so I feel it's important that I act as an ally with the power and control that I have to help make a situation better. So what I attempted to do was understand our collection better when it comes to diversity so we could help inform our collection policy to change the situation for the more positive. So what I did specifically to educate myself on this issue was really perhaps not enough because our goal really was just in some ways to be a bean counter, counting numbers and comparing them. But we did meet with the vice dean of research. Her name is Nassine, and she's a music education professor that has a lot of experience working with EDI. And so we spoke with her at length about appropriate language and appropriate terminology. And so again, I'd like to apologize for getting it wrong. That said, when we're looking at our representation in streaming services, if we look at the representation for our entire streaming collections, we could see that there are a lot more men represented than women, but about a quarter of the representation of the creative, powerful creative forces in the item were women. When we look at DocuSeek, however, we see well over the average amount are women, which is possibly because the purpose of that collection really was to have sort of more progressive issue-oriented documentaries. So perhaps that's not a surprise. When we look at Criterion on Demand, though, for a contrast, we could see the representation of women as creators is substantially less than both DocuSeek and the average. New slide, please. If we look at where these people came from, when we look at Criterion on Demand, we could see it's almost entirely from the United States. A little bit from United Kingdom, a little bit from Canada. The rest is from Europe. Next slide, please. If we look at My Media, however, the story's a little bit different. And the background with My Media is interesting. As I mentioned earlier, it is a locally created streaming service. It really came into importance during COVID when we had professors that were saying we need to teach this film in our classroom. They needed to integrate things immediately into their curriculum. So it's very much curated and it's also very much current. So we're dealing with what people want to watch and integrate into their curriculum now. And so we're seeing a lot more from Canada and still a lot of people from the United States, United Kingdom. But when we look at, again, the long tail here, we see a lot of people from a lot of different parts of the world showing up. So I think that that says something about the importance of currency, but curation. Next slide, please, Trevor. If we look at our physical collection, keeping in mind this physical collection is very old. We've been collecting VHSs since they started being sold. And so it's responding to different needs over different periods of time. That said, it looks very much like Criterion on Demand when we look at the makeup of the creators. Most of them are men, and most of them are from the United States. Next slide, please.
So on the topic of subject headings, again, one key distinction worth noting is how they are applied in film collections compared to sound recordings. Subject headings in music tend to focus on the arrangement, era, or style of music, whereas subject headings in film often allude to the themes within a film's narrative content. This allows us to analyze the diversity within a collection in a more holistic fashion, engaging with the subject matter within films rather than relying solely on greater demographics. One central finding in our research is the role of curation in supporting the inclusion of EDI-related content. Both My Media and our physical collection consist largely of individually selected titles, and as a result, we see a high concentration of subject headings related to EDI in both. This curated approach contrasts sharply with the broader unmediated subscription models in platforms like Criterion on Demand. Well, DocuSeek services like DocuSeek also show the higher number of EDI relevant subject headings. That's largely due to the explicit focus on social issues and documentary film on the platform. Their entire catalog is designed to engage with these themes, so it's expected that many of the titles are tagged accordingly with the subject data. Another important consideration with My Media is its currency. Although the platform existed prior to the pandemic, its use increased significantly in recent years, especially as our teaching and learning environment shifted online. This means it likely reflects our more recent faculty interests and course needs. Unlike our physical collection, which has grown gradually over decades, titles on My Media were often acquired in direct response to faculty requests. And we also noticed a marked increase in streaming acquisitions during the early years of the pandemic. This coincided with our library's introduction of a formal EDI collection development mandate. That context is crucial. Faculty were actively seeking to diversify their syllabi in response to global trends and events. And at the same time, we were prioritizing the purchasing of streaming formats to support remote instruction. So when we look at the timing and format of acquisition, it's clear that streaming requests were prioritized over physical formats during that time period. And many of those streaming titles aligned with our EDI goals.
So if we look now at some of the results we got from our film collection when we were looking at the social justice terms. Now, keep in mind, social justice terms was a phrase and all the terms themselves we got from the American School Psychology Association. And we were working with Library of Congress subject headings. When we look at our physical collection, we could see that about 3.75% of the subject terms used related to EDI. If we look at criterion, about not even two, 1.75. My media, however, was the clear winner here. Over 12% of the terms, of the subject terms used related in one way, either neutral or active, to diversity. DocuSeek was also quite good. Canopy, a bit better than our physical collection. Next slide, please. So then when we look a little bit closer, we see that Criterion on Command didn't even make this chart because the percentages we were looking at when we got down to the individual titles were in the 100th%. So we're really very small and not really chartable. But when we look at gender and sex, we see that my media here is, right across the board. When we look at disability and size discrimination, however, we see very little mention of that at all. Culture and religion, not much discussed there that fit into those categories, or at least it was fairly similar across the various collections. Allyship and advocacy was a little bit better in DocuSeek than my media, but socioeconomic status is really where DocuSeek seemed to really perform well. Next slide, please. And so this one is very much the same as the last slide, but instead of percentages of the collection, I was just looking at raw numbers. So even though our physical collection didn't necessarily percentage-wise perform that well that often, it's just so huge that there were a number of titles in our physical collection that were able to fit into various different sort of diversity-related subject headings. Next slide, please.
So in thinking about these findings, it's also important to recognize a few key limitations of our study. First, there's the issue of sample size. For example, our Canopy collection consists of about 619 titles and 2,077 subject headings. Well, our physical collection contains over 28,000 titles and more than 81,000 subject headings. So that difference in scale inevitably affects the kind of comparisons we can draw. The second, our study represents only a single snapshot in time. Subscription-based streaming platforms like Criterion On Demand are highly dynamic. Titles come and go as licensing agreements change. So any conclusions we draw about streaming collections are inherently provisional. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the data itself is imperfect. Metadata captures the nuance of identity or intersectionality largely doesn't exist. And even if where identity markers like gender might be available for creators, recording and using that information raises important ethical considerations. Finally, we have to account for changes in cataloging practices over time. Some records are richly detailed, offering multiple creator fields and numerous subject headings to analyze, while others are much more sparse. We especially see this with older titles where card catalog standards and early computing limitations dictated the amount of metadata included in a given record. This inconsistency affects both subject and creator information across different areas of cataloging. So while we can surface meaningful patterns, we have to keep these limitations in mind while interpreting the results. So in summary, our analysis of the film and sound recording collections confirmed a common refrain within the literature that it can be challenging to make overarching conclusions about diversity within audiovisual collections with the limited metadata currently available in our library catalogs. It also demonstrated the challenges involved in attempting to accurately identify and quantify EDI-related content through subject heading analysis, particularly when analyzing datasets of tens of thousands of records. Despite these obstacles, our research did provide us with some valuable takeaways and considerations. First and foremost, it confirmed our belief about the importance of flexibility in terms of format. And given that a large percentage of films are still only available to libraries in physical format, it is not unreasonable to then conclude that foregoing the purchase of DVDs and Blu-rays will inevitably result in a less rich and diverse film collection. Similarly, foregoing the purchase of sound recordings in physical format will inevitably place significant limits on the uniqueness and diversity within our sound recording collections. This leads us to a key conclusion raised in our research. It is less a question about physical versus streaming when it comes to markers of diversity. Rather, it is the ability to be selective and intentional about what content gets acquired that is most essential in terms of maintaining rich and diverse media collections. With this in mind, I think it's worth touching on a few key considerations regarding the present state of affairs in media library access and acquisitions. In academic libraries, it is not uncommon to digitally license individual films that can be accessed through the web browser or streaming device, whereas on the music collection side of things, Naxos is really the only common means of providing digital access to sound recordings. This again speaks to the importance of continuing to collect music in physical formats for the sake of diversity as well as long-term access and preservation. Also worth considering in this context is the question of how our users are most commonly accessing music and film formats or materials, and how this question might affect our collection practices and priorities. Well, we can't expect all our users to have access to a consumer subscription music streaming service like Apple Music or Spotify, nor is it reasonable to expect our users to rely on such services for educational purposes. I think it's fair to assume that these platforms are largely replacing both our library's physical and streaming music collections as the primary means of music consumption for our users. To this end, when it comes to classical and jazz specifically, it's worth noting that Naxos does offer a unique product, particularly in terms of metadata and discovery that commercial services like Apple Music have only started to explore recently with the rollout of Apple Music Classical, for example. That said, the unparalleled access and ease of use that the likes of Apple Music and Spotify provide means that getting our users to even pay attention and make use of our library sound recording collections is a barrier in and of itself, which further emphasizes the value of maintaining diverse media collections outside of the Naxos subscription model. Relatedly, on the film side of things, we are witnessing a disturbing trend towards exclusive streaming rights going to consumer subscription services like Netflix and Amazon Prime, often leaving no alternative for educational streaming rights. This is further complicated by the fact that many new titles, including major motion pictures and award winners, aren't even getting a physical release. So libraries find themselves with no way to collect all sorts of AV content that is needed for teaching and research purposes today, not to mention the importance of preserving this content for teaching and research purposes in the future. But before we get too far down the rabbit hole of the fast evolving and rapidly changing world of access to audiovisual materials in academic libraries, I'd like to circle back and conclude with one quick reflection on the two central questions that we touched on at the beginning of our presentation, questions at the heart of our research project. In response to the first question displayed before us, our analysis suggested that it is less a matter of the shifting medium of the day and more a matter of careful stewardship and individualized curation that will ensure our collections continue to include inclusive and diverse perspectives. Format may be a consideration within the curatorial process when considering the added research value of long-term access to media in the form of a Blu-ray or CD, for example, as compared to a value of a limited-term digital access via a short-term license or subscription. In reflecting to the second question, I keep coming back to the points first raised by Sandra Chu 24 years ago. The need for criteria to assess any EDI topic and a tool of method or methodology sufficiently capable of analyzing the nuance of diverse subjects within the context of significantly large sets of metadata. Despite all the progress we've made in information technology and science throughout the past 24 years since Chu's article, I find it fascinating that in many ways we are still faced with some of the same challenges and no closer to a resolution. At the same time, is also a very realistic possibility that through the ongoing technological breakthroughs in the way of large language models, machine learning, and quantum computing, we may find ourselves at the precipices of Chu's vision. However, in the meantime, as the saying goes, perfect is the enemy of good. And while we should be careful to draw too broad of conclusions with the messy data currently available to us, I do believe that our methodology and research not only allowed us to gain better, if imperfect, understanding of the diversity within our music and film collections, this analysis also serves to further support our communal goal of gaining a better understanding of what it means to continue to build diverse and inclusive collections in this ever-evolving time of media librarianship. So thank you again for attending our presentation. And if you'd like to learn more about this research, we'd highly encourage you to check out the aforementioned article in our recently published issue of the Canadian Journal of Academic Libraries. And I've just put the citation there at the bottom of the link, and we can share out the slides so you can have the hyperlink there as well. Thanks all.